I hear that intro music every time, and it never ceases to pump me up and get me excited for what we're about to talk about. And I hope that you all are feeling the same way. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Brandon Evans. I'm joined here with Eric Johnson. We're both instructors at the SANS Institute. And we've taken you on a journey where we've talked about hacks and all sorts of war stories that we've had in the field. The most recent war story that we've had has been working on the update for our courses 510 and 540, which hopefully I'll get a chance to update you on at the end of the session because we had a lot of awesome content we've been staying up all night to work on. But today we're going to pivot a little bit to talk a little bit more about the defending and inventory of our cloud environments, because it's really important to know what we have in order to defend it and in order to find instances and infrastructure that is potentially unhealthy, such that we can remediate any of those hacks that we find in the field. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to Eric, and we're going to look at Azure Defender, how Azure Defender can be used to interact with the other two cloud providers, and how we can use this to stop the revenge of the hacks.
Awesome. Thanks, Brandon. Let's go ahead and I'll pull Defender up here, and we can kind of take a look at what I've got set up. And this is a SANS subscription, one that I commonly use for, deploying our lab environments and just doing some testing against some key services and things like that. So let's make sure that the screen is actually showing here. Just make sure that's good. There we are. So you all should be seeing at least my version of Microsoft Defender for Cloud that's in a subscription that Brandon and I use called SANS Cloud Security. So at a high level, let's just start with, well, what is Defender for Cloud for those of you that have not used it before? This is Microsoft's really cloud security posture management tool. CSPM is kind of that acronym that it gets. And out of the box, if you go into your Azure subscription without really doing anything, you will have some inventory in there, and you'll have a secure score in there that kind of tells you, here's your Azure resources, here's the configurations, and here's maybe a few tips and tricks on what you can do to harden or make that infrastructure more secure. So that's kind of the baseline state. Brandon, have you seen anything interesting in those findings over, your experience with Defender where you think this is like the go-to CSPM tool if you're just using Azure, or do you think we need more?
Well, there's so many compliance regimes that you can audit your environments against using Azure Defender. I know that it's useful for PCI, DSS, for ISO, multiple different numbers and all that good stuff. But obviously we have to go beyond just securing our Azure account, because if we're in a multi-cloud environment, we certainly need to secure our GCP and AWS resources as well.
Yeah, so you mentioned some of let's poke around here for just a sec. We'll kind of walk through what's in here, at least for the Azure bits. So the first, if you go down to this cloud security section in the left-hand side, the security posture section is really where you're going to see kind of all of your monitored resources and some recommendations, as well as you'll notice I've got a few environments here, and I promise we'll get to that here in a little bit. But that's at least where you can start to see kind of your unhealthy resources, as well as, recommendations on what you can fix. The regulatory compliance piece, this is where you were kind of referring to a bunch of the different options in here. So out of the box, you've got your Azure Security Benchmark, which they're on version 3, that gives you, here's the big list of controls. You can see we're not, passing all of these, which is kind of virtually impossible depending on how you set your clouds up. But yeah, there is support, comparing that to ISO 27001, which looks like there's a new dashboard for that. I've never seen this pop up before. And then there's PCI, and then there's also kind of the SOC. Those are the default Azure, regulatory compliance ones. I've got some extra ones showing up here that we'll dig into here in a little bit. So that's really built on top of all of these compliance policies are built on top of the Azure policy, which is kind of a JSON structured language for querying live resources and also looking at their configurations and generating some of these findings. I noticed Steven jumped in the chat and said, "Hey, there's some noise in here too," which is almost like any security tool. We've all spent the time looking at half the findings and saying, "Well, that's garbage. We need to go shut that off or dismiss it," and things like that. Which is, I believe, if you go up into the recommendations section here, let's maybe dig into a finding. Let's try to find where we can do that.
Yeah,
So
that's what I really like about the Azure Defender is it allows you to show what is the highest priority or the easiest thing to fix to get the maximum gains. So yeah, there may be a lot of findings that we simply don't care about, but hey, we can tackle them one by one. And if we get to the bottom and we can solve the high hanging fruit, awesome. But it's gonna take a really long time to get there anyway.
yeah, and this is the web UI version. You could obviously probably automate this, with some command line scripts and some PowerShell scripts. But I just kind of dug in on one that maybe this is complaining about log analytics not being installed on our lab virtual machine that's inside our subscription. Maybe we're using some other logging agent. Maybe log analytics isn't our chosen place for this, right? Maybe we're using something like open telemetry and we've got that agent pumping data, into some other location. So going back to Steve's question in the chat comments, we could probably click on these two resources if we knew that wasn't exactly something that we cared about fixing, and just mark these as an exempt from, this particular thing. So as we look at the exemption screen here, there's actually a lot of detail on here in terms of what you can select. So I picked the selected resources. Notice it's already yelling at me. That's a premium feature inside of here. And I don't know, are you having trouble reading it? I can zoom in on that just a touch too.
A little bit would be helpful, yes. There's just so much text in the Azure portal.
Oh my gosh, yeah. So let's go through this. So you can set an expiration date. That's kind of cool. Maybe I'm giving the dev team something like, hey, look, you've got a month to fix your Terraform and go fix this configuration. Remind me again in a month. So that's kind of cool. Let's just say mitigated here. Like we've got a third party, hotel for the win, something like that, right? We're not going to use the Azure piece to this. And let's create an exemption. And it says, okay, we've saved that thing out. And it said, within the next 30 minutes, I think it said we'd get that updated on the dashboard for you. So that's at least kind of the process you have to go through to go in and fix a lot of those CSPM style issues.
One thing that I noticed here, maybe not to get ahead of ourselves, but I see that trigger logic app button. What's that about?
Oh, that's kind of cool. Let me go back to, I'm actually curious where the wizard would take me if I picked that. But the logic app, I kind of compare these to step functions in AWS a little bit. So think of kind of a function, serverless driven workflow where you could create a logic app. And if this finding pops up, you can kind of auto trigger, some sort of a workflow. So, maybe like if that log agent isn't on there and it should be, I'm pretty sure you could set up a function to go in and connect to that particular VM, install the logging agent, and that would kind of auto remediate it in a sense, or maybe kick off a Slack notification or send something out via PagerDuty, whatever, you want your process to look like.
Certainly. And Azure Logic Apps are basically a low code, no code solution. But let's be real, we need code. If we didn't need code, I wouldn't have a job. And as a result, whenever you cannot automate something with the drag and drop capabilities that the Azure Logic App provides, you can always have the Logic App trigger an Azure function, which can obviously run arbitrary code.
Yeah, so let's click the button here. Let's see what this brings up actually. So I think it's really just wanting us to select an Azure Logic app that we've already created. I was kind of wondering if it was going to walk me through, hey, here's how you would do this and how you would set this up.
That'd be way too easy.
I know, right? Take me right into the next step if I wanted to automate it.
That would be a good design. We can't have that.
Yeah. So if we had created one, with whatever our process is, it looks like that's kind of your, it kind of goes from, CSPM to kind of that automated remediation side of of this if you really want to fix stuff as they pop up, or at least notify people. So that's definitely a cool capability inside of here. Anything else on at least the suppressing or fine tuning the issues, or on the recommendations or flow side, that you think's worth poking at?
There's one thing that we talked about in 5.10 that I thought we could extrapolate a little bit on. So in Azure, we can create custom policies, I believe, to find custom violations. However, unlike AWS, I'm under the impression that we can't import findings from external tools. Is that accurate?
That's a good question. And I've noticed in here, so we'll go back to your policy comment first. One thing I noticed the last time I was in here, I was actually trying to write my own Azure policy. And I came into this particular list of recommendations, and what I found was one that was really, really close to what I wanted. And you can actually click this view policy definition button and actually see, these are the canned kind of built-in Azure policies that are, maintained by Microsoft essentially. So you can see this one's trying to look for, the public access capability being disabled on a storage account. And you can kind of come in here and see the policy rule in terms of, okay, we're looking for the storage account type, and we are looking for, it looks like, an exclusion list. So basically it can't be in this list. Maybe it's something that has to be public, for example, like a CDN backend origin storage account kind of requires public. So some of the third-party CDNs like Verizon, et cetera, can actually get to it. And then it goes a little bit deeper. Let's see if I can scroll down a little further in here. This might be my zoom capability.
I think so.
Yeah, there we go. I'll zoom out just a second. And you can eventually get to the fun one. I know it's probably kind of hard to read, but that's basically saying, hey, the allow public blob public access setting has to be false. Otherwise, this thing is going to show up. And what I notice is you can export them, you can create a duplicate and kind of save your own policy definition as well. So it's a really easy way, in my opinion, to learn kind of how to write Azure policies. Let me get out of this editor. I'll zoom back in here. So that's how I've written a couple of custom ones, is just by locating that and kind of finding a close one and then tweaking it a little bit to match what I was hoping for.
Yes, so that's the capability to create custom policies.
Yep.
What I wanted to follow up on is that in AWS Security Hub, there's also the ability to import findings from other tools, as long as those other tools support the Amazon Security Finding Format, or ASFF. Is there anything like that in Azure where I could, let's say, take vulnerabilities from my vulnerability management on-prem solution and import them into Azure Defender, or is that out of scope for Azure Defender?
I haven't seen a custom findings format, something like ASFF that works per se inside of Defender. And I also haven't really seen an API for just creating some completely custom issue. Obviously, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It's just not super obvious, at least for me, from this interface or through the AZ CLI, that is actually there or not. I've not really seen it documented that, hey, here you can upload this big XML file full of data and it'll just show up in Defender.
I'm flabbergasted, Eric. You haven't read every single word of the Azure documentation?
There's a lot in there. It's pretty intensive. Now, I suspect if you, I'm kind of dialing in on this SIM, the information and event management option here. So if we go into this SIM option, suddenly I think honestly what they're wanting you to do, if that's the capability you're looking for, is to start feeding Defender into another, more full-featured SIM system, which obviously in Azure is Azure Sentinel, right? So I feel like they would want you to push your baseline Defender data into something like Sentinel, and then that would give you, the capability to start monitoring your own custom events or, whatever other data feeds you're trying to push in here.
Great minds think alike, because I think that's exactly what Steve said in the comments.
It sounds like Steve maybe had done this before, which, wouldn't be shocking because he's worked in a lot of these different clouds. So that's kind of where my gut would lead me forward to, is rather than trying to force Defender into something that maybe it's not or wasn't really designed to be, is to start looking at integrating with a more capable like information management and event system.
Yeah, and as our YouTube just commented, Steve is quite the Sans Cloud ace. He's gone from being in security for a very long time to learning about cloud security and just leveling up in that area. And it's a pleasure to call him a former coworker when we were both working at Asurion together. So it's
Yeah.
awesome to see us all level up in that cloud ace journey.
Yeah, maybe we need to force Steve to come on here on the next round and get a guest onto the episode. The next piece that I think is interesting, and it kind of takes, let me open this workload protection thing up. So up to this point, it's been all about CSPM, right? Just security posture management and knowing when you've got kind of bad configurations on resources. And the one thing that is inside of Defender for Cloud that gets you kind of close to what you would see with like an AWS guard duty is kind of that live threat intelligence capability, where it's actually looking at your containers, or it's looking at like the flow logs inside of your VNets, or it's looking at the actual requests coming into your storage account, and it's actually looking for active threats against that environment. So it kind of takes your cloud security posture management solution, as far as acronyms go, and it kind of turns you into a cloud workloads protection, a CWP. Have you seen that acronym thrown around on the magic quadrant stuff?
The main Magic Quadrant that I've paid attention to is the infrastructure as a service Magic Quadrant, and I guess I don't spend as much time as you looking at that because I don't know actually.
Yeah, you're lucky. There's just all these new cloud acronyms, but it honestly, this is pretty cool. If you are kind of native to the Azure ecosystem, this is kind of your next step, is if you want, workload protection. And let me expand this out. This might make it zoom out just a little bit, but hopefully that's still readable. I've fully enabled this, and just for the record, if you're playing with this at home, this typically comes with a 30-day kind of freebie trial to it. And once your 30 days are up, you're going to rack up some pretty good bills if you have a lot of resources running inside of your subscription, because suddenly price wise, you're looking at, maybe $15 a server. You're looking at some dollars per month for an app service, another $15 for each, Kubernetes cluster and Azure registry that you're monitoring. And that just goes up exponentially as you keep building resources inside of the cloud. So I guess that's the first thing to note here. But once it's on, you will start to get, and I don't have any security alerts here. I maybe should have launched a bunch of like in-map scans and junk against some of these VMs to see if it would actually trigger kind of like an SSH brute force attack or something like that. But this is where you would start to see those actual security alerts showing up. We do have one item in here. So if you look at the container image scanning capability, this is a registry that I've pushed kind of a really old image into as part of testing something else out. And you can at least see I've got a couple of container images in here that, they've scanned with, I want to say Azure's using like Qualys probably under the hood, or at least they were at one point, to scan container images for vulnerabilities. And it's just saying, hey, you've got a medium level CVE from back in 2020 inside of this container image. You should probably patch that. So that's where some of that kind of live threat intel is going to show up.
Well, as a developer, I've heard things like that all the time. Hey, patch this medium vulnerability in this random library that's in your container. And I'll always ask myself, why does this really matter, considering that this library is not even necessarily being executed in my container? Well, the answer I've kind of come to through meditation has just been, I don't want to think about this anymore. I don't want to have to prove to people that this vulnerability cannot be exploited on my container. It is much easier for me to just fix it, make the warning go away. And hey, did I waste my time? Maybe, but way less time was wasted than if I had to make the case that this was not worth remediating.
Yeah, it's an interesting problem, especially, I mean, this could probably goes for a lot of the quote supply chain vulnerability scanners out there, because a lot of them are just looking at, package manifest and saying, hey, this library and this version exists. You've got a potential problem here. There's some, one thing I love about Trivy is there's an option with Trivy, which is kind of the Aquasex scanner that will allow you to only display vulnerabilities that actually have a patch available. So even if there's 50, different CVEs out in that container, it might only show you 10 of them, because it's only going to say these are 10 libraries that you truly can fix with, like a Yum upgrade or something like that. The other piece to that, like you said, is, does the application actually execute it? And that's like a whole nother level of kind of runtime instrumentation. And I think most folks, like you said, you know what, I'm just going to patch it and make it go away, versus trying to prove that out.
The cost of a false negative is far greater than the cost of a false positive.
Yeah, for sure.
It's it as true as that is, it's also a very frustrating philosophy, because at that point we could just mark everything as vulnerable, then we'll never have a false negative.
Yeah, so that's workload protection. I think we've hit regulatory compliance, obviously security posture is kind of that secure score. And those are kind of the main, also, the triggering Azure logic apps and, how to suppress these. I think that covers the major, at least, capabilities for Azure native resources. Can you think of anything else that's worth touching base on?
We talked about containers. We talked about vulnerabilities on the VM proper. Azure Defender, does it have any capabilities like static analysis or dynamic analysis for the applications running on the VMs?
That's a good question. And it's not well published. If we go back to these workload protection capabilities here, if there was going to be anything like that, this is probably where that would live. But to my knowledge, the containers is probably the closest that we've got. That does actually, integrate with Azure Kubernetes service, and it uses some more like next level admission control kind of gatekeepers, a Kubernetes security tool that lets you kind of inject policies as webhooks into the Kubernetes cluster. And this does allow you to write Azure policies like we just looked at for Defender, except Kubernetes can read those Azure policies and actually enforce webhooks based on the same JSON schema. But that's still not really doing, dynamic, running like a Zap or a burp scan or anything like that against an endpoint. I don't think any of it does code analysis to, look at your Terraform code or your Node.js code or anything like that. So I think that's a completely separate concept that that you've got to figure out as well.
That makes sense.
So the last thing that I really wanted to touch on, and this is kind of a loaded topic, is in preview, over the last 12 months or so, I've saw these options or these environments show up in here for quite some time. And by default, right now we're monitoring one Azure subscription. And there was, a day where suddenly an AWS account option showed up, and I thought, oh, that's pretty cool. And then the GCP project option showed up, and I said, okay, well, that's really cool. And it eventually went from preview. I think certain pieces of this might be GA now, but I have to go look at the docs to kind of see where it's at in the life cycle. And I hadn't really taken the time to play with this yet. So now that we understand Defender, what I wanted to explore for the remainder is from an overall like multi-cloud defensive question. Could you get full visibility to more than Azure with this tool? And how easy is it to set up? And what does it look like as you kind of go through that process? So you'll notice I've got one AWS account added here, and I've got one GCP account, which means I have gone through that process and I've at least got some insight into how this whole thing is set up. So the idea I think that Microsoft is pushing you towards here is, could you use Defender to monitor all of your different cloud resources, at least in the big three public ones?
The answer is yes.
And to what degree, I still can't quite comment on the quality of this, but it looks pretty good so far. And what I did, and I did this ahead of time because Defender does take, in some cases like 6 hours to actually recompute the secure score and actually get all of the data kind of fed into the dashboard. But what I did first, I added GCP first. So I kind of came in here and said, add environment, Google Cloud Platform. And I'll just show you the beginning of the wizard here. And ultimately, what it wants you to do is name the connector. So I just said, sec 510 something or other, right? And then you can choose actually to monitor a single GCP project, which is what I did because I'm just kind of playing around here. But it looks like in preview is the capability to actually monitor an entire GCP organization, which is pretty cool from a GCP org level perspective, like most enterprises would have. So I did single project, and you've got to store the data in a resource group. So you got to create a resource group. And really, it's just two fields. What is the unique GCP project number, and what's the project ID? And then you hit next. And you choose from some of the plans that are offered. Now, CSPM, which is kind of just the looking at resource configuration, you're opted in by default. But there's two other interesting options where you can use the Azure Arc agent on your GCP VMs. So when you deploy this, it'll automatically go onto your GCP virtual machines and put the Azure Arc agent on there and start feeding actual OS level vulnerability scanning and configuration alerts into Defender for Cloud, which is kind of cool. There's also a Kubernetes option, which very similarly is it'll go look at your GKE clusters and things like that and start feeding that kind of GKE data back to you as well. So those are kind of two, you can choose to turn those on, obviously cost associated per VM, per cluster, et cetera. So let me pause there for a moment. How are you feeling so far?
I heard Azure and cost next to each other and having some flashbacks that are very concerning.
Yeah, I'll maybe in a week post what this whole little demo cost me in terms of everything running in here. But I noticed my projected bill at the end of the month is already about 3x what it probably should be, just to give you an idea.
Yeah, and yet they want us to get premium on top of that in order to do a variety of different things like we saw earlier.
Yeah.
One thing that I wanted to mention, just because it's unbelievably confusing, is the naming. So right now, the service is called Microsoft Defender for Cloud. But previously, there were two names for this that were referring to separate different capabilities. So there was Azure Security Center, and then there was the Azure Security Center, and then the Azure Defender plan for the Azure Security Center.
Yeah.
So that was the name of the premium version of this capability. And now they changed both of those things to be called the Microsoft Defender for Cloud. So, yep. Eric, does that mean that they just got rid of the free tier, or is it all premium now, or what happened there?
So they rebranded. Was it at some point last year? I kind of looked there and thought to myself, "Oh Lord, I have a lot of different material that I need to go update with this new name." And what happened was, okay, so Security Center inside of it had Azure Defender, which is that workload protection capability that we looked at. And out of the box, Defender was disabled in a free state. So it was just off. And you could enable Defender, and that's when you start racking up. That's the cloud workload protection, that CWP capability. That's like $15 a VM, et cetera. And what that moved to is now the whole thing is Defender for cloud. And the workload protection, I actually think it's named a lot better now than it was before, because Defender for cloud itself, your inventory, your secure score, all those things are enabled and part of the quote free tier inside of here. Once you enable workload protection, the CWP feature, that's basically moving you up to the standard charges, and that CWP workload protection feature is disabled by default. So it's still there in the same pattern or same kind of pricing structure that it was before. It's just named a little bit differently. I'm not entirely sure if these cloud connectors, I've had CWP on already, so I'm not entirely sure if you have to turn that on to get this. I think you can do this without it as part of the free tier, but you will not be able to turn on like the VM, Azure Arc Agent, or the Kubernetes options without that workload protection feature turned on. So in my head, as I kind of walked through this wizard, the first question I really had was, okay, how is Defender going to authenticate to GCP? And in kind of a very simplistic fashion, the way that I thought it would work is I thought it would say, go to GCP, create a service account, download a service account key file, the long-lived credential, and then upload it in here and hit save. That's in my head what I thought it would do. And as you go through this wizard, the way that GCP works is that actually, when you pick all the options, it dumps you this massive bash script. And it just says, go to your terminal and run this inside of your GCP project with a pretty powerful account that's got full access to like IAM and a feature called workload identity. So I was pretty thrilled to see that it actually isn't using service account key files. It's using a newer feature called workload identity pools to do JWT based authentication and almost like single sign-on into your GCP account, which is pretty neat.
Yeah, so this gives me two thoughts right off the bat. Number one is that Azure supplying commands for you to run on your local machine just sounds rife for exploitation. I really hope that this particular service is highly locked down, because if I could change those commands to anything arbitrary, oh my goodness, a lot of bad things could happen. But I sure would hope and imagine that a lot of security scrutiny is given towards the security feature. I'm going to be cautiously optimistic about that. The second thing that it makes me think about is that workload identity concept. I know that we talked about that pretty recently. Can you go into a little bit more detail about what workload identity pools are all about?
Yeah. The cool thing, I guess, going to the bash script piece is that it is all of the commands you kind of iterated out in a copy paste format. So at least they didn't just say blindly do a bin bash on a curl command and just run whatever's in the thing on GitHub. So at least they gave you the opportunity to see what it actually was doing. And obviously, I'm probably more cautious than a lot of cloud users, where I actually read every command and I ran them all individually. And I made sure I understood what they were doing before I actually ran them, and walked through the different policies that were required and a lot of those things. But yeah, let's jump over. So I'm logged into this GCP project here. So I've switched clouds completely for those of you watching, thinking, wow, that UI looks so much better than the Azure one. And it's because it's in GCP. So this is the Sec 510 project that I've connected to Defender. And let me just go back to the kind of dashboard screen for this particular project. So let me get all the way out of here. So this is what you would see if you logged into GCP out of the box, right? And I've got some resources, storage, cloud functions, BQ, App Engine, GCEs, databases, a lot of stuff in here. and you're going to the IAM, the Identity and Access Management Service. And what you're looking for here is Workload Identity Federation. So this is essentially the configuration that Azure Defender or Microsoft Defender, I'm going to get that wrong for so many years, by the way, is creating for you. And what you're actually doing here is just creating trust between your GCP project and an external identity provider like OpenID Connect. And you can see I've got a couple in here. I've got one for our Sec10, Sec510 lab environment that I've been playing with because we've got an IDP that we stand up on day 5. And I've got one for GitHub. So GitHub has an identity provider. So a GitHub action can automatically assume a service account or impersonate a service account inside of this project. And then the Microsoft Defender for Cloud one is the one that their script created. And it's kind of cool. You can see the usage here. If I just kind of go across the last 6-hour timeline, it's probably hard to see, but very faintly, there's kind of these little dots here, right? Where you can see some of the activity amongst these. And you can see this large spike here a few hours ago. And I'm pretty sure that's Defender going in and like re-grabbing the entire inventory of data from my GCP project. So it's kind of neat. You can actually see it, what it's up to.
Yeah, this is a really cool capability because as a result, we don't have to have those long-lived credentials. We can basically exchange our credentials with whatever capability that we want for a temporary access token, which is pretty cool. It's still, you still have to think about the credentials that you use to exchange for those temporary credentials. Those could still be permanent, right? If you're logging in as an individual, your credentials are long-lived. You may get a short-lived set of credentials afterwards, but your initial set are still long-lived. So there's
for sure.
There's definitely some things to think about here for sure. I see a comment that was sent that I want to respond to. There was a comment talking about how Microsoft Defender, does it help us prevent, detect, and respond with increased visibility? It's definitely mostly on the detection side. I mean, we can prevent things by remediating the issues that are provided there. But prevention, that's basically where that ends. And also in terms of responding, we can automatically respond using things like Azure Logic Apps or Azure Functions, which we mentioned earlier. But that's a lot more advanced than just saying, hey, look out for vulnerabilities and report them in this dashboard.
Yeah, I think prevention, you're really looking at Azure policy for that part, because that's where we kind of looked at that JSON, right? You can attach one of those in Azure policy to a subscription, and that will actually block API calls with those misconfigured items as you're trying to create new. But like you said, it's important to realize that is a preventative control. It's not going to go back and fix all of the old things that pre-exist in the subscription. So that's where you need Defender to detect and maybe auto remediate.
Exactly. When you say block those API calls, what you're saying is, for example, block the ability to create a new storage account with a bad setting. You're not blocking the ability for people to retrieve the contents of an existing storage account at all.
No, it's just net new resources.
And I think in AWS config allows you to do that. AWS config has some automated remediations. I don't think there's something like that in Azure, but I also know that AWS config is one of the most expensive services that they offer outside of Macy.
Yep, it's it can add up. Depends on how many resources you've got. So, all right, let's take a quick look here. What you're staring at as we kind of go back to the story here is we created an identity pool inside of GCP, and you'll notice there's 4 different identity providers, one for containers, one for CSPM, which is the one that Defender's interacting with. So let me hit the edit button on this, and I'll kind of show you the settings. And what we're doing here is actually setting up the trust with, I Googled this UUID because I'm like, who created that? Where did that come from? And that appears to be like Microsoft has a tenant that hosts their, central identity provider that a lot of the underlying services are using. And this is their URL, the authentication URL, where if you did like the .well-known slash, I think it's like auth or something like that, that's where you would see all of the keys and how the whole thing is configured. So what we're saying is GCP is going to trust JSON Web Tokens issued by that identity provider. And notice it actually has a custom audience that also is required to be in the token. And Defender is going to put this audience in the request for a JWT to allow it to authenticate to this particular identity pool. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I see another question in the comments that I want to just address before we continue. Yes, Azure Defender and Microsoft Defender and everything that you see here is itself cloud-based, so it should be able to access all of the resources within their own cloud. And here we're talking about how to authenticate to the other clouds to look at those resources. So Azure storage can be monitored using Microsoft Defender for Cloud, of course. Absolutely.
Yeah, and that's pretty much what we're setting up here is we want Defender to be able to monitor a GCS bucket. So with the CSPM provider setup, you then connect a service account to the pool. And what this is allowing you to do is say, if I can authenticate using that JWT that I just looked at, is which service account are you allowed to impersonate? So we created a service account called Microsoft Defender CSPM. And this is now allowing Defender to go in and look at, that GCS bucket and get all of the different settings that are on there. So once you go through the wizard, we go back to Defender for Cloud, and let's just go to the overview. You'll see in the resources here, I've got a full, set of GCP resources showing up in here, which we can click on. And you can actually start to go through and look at just all of the recommendations, maybe for just those GCP resources. And we can start to see a lot of that stuff in here. So that's the full feature. So here's our SQL database that's being evaluated from our environments. Let me find one that's failing in here. So I've got an unhealthy VPC here. Let's see what. Yeah, so we've got flow logging disabled in one of our subnets inside of our GCP project, and that's showing up now inside of Defender with actual kind of general remediation instructions as well, or descriptions and remediation steps. So, I mean, this is Microsoft learning GCP inside and out to say, here, you need to go to this URL in your Google Cloud project, edit the subnet, turn flow logs on, and hit save to fix this, which is pretty impressive if you think about all the work that they had to do to put this in play.
Absolutely. I have to give them a lot of credit for even trying to do this. I don't think the other two cloud providers have really attempted to speak the other clouds' languages. So I think that's extremely commendable. I hope to see this service evolve further. One quick thing, because you happen to pick an issue here that we just talked about last week. I had a realization last week about GCP VPC flow logs that was extremely concerning. And that is when you turn on VPC flow logs in GCP, at most about 1 out of every 10 packets will be captured. Even if you indicate a sampling rate of 100%, that will still mean 1 out of every 10 packets. If you set it to 50%, now you're getting 1 out of every 20 packets. It's very, very bizarre that they have that limitation. So yeah, Microsoft says turn on VPC flow logs. Absolutely. 1 out of every 10 packets is better than 0 packets, but that was a really eye-opening finding that we discussed last week. And thanks to Pierre Ledome for bringing that to my attention, another SANS instructor.
Yeah, that's kind of a baffling one. it seems like the sampling rate field, in my opinion, is just kind of miscategorized, where it should probably only allow up to 0.1 to make that obvious that that's the maximum amount of traffic that you can actually get
No, you're sampling 100%
of
of
the
the
10.
things that are captured, but the maximum of the capture is 1 out of every 10. So
Yeah, it's
I
just
don't know
not
if they want.
obvious through the API that that's not what that means. It's not what you think it is.
Absolutely. I don't know if they want to advertise that fact. I don't know. It's very, very bizarre.
So the
Uh,
real question is if you need 100%, you have to use something like full packet capture on the network interface. You got to set it up yourself. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, you have to either run packet capture software on the endpoint, or you have to use packet mirroring, which copies all of the network traffic from one VM to another, and then run network packet analysis tools on that VM. That is their
Gotcha.
official explanation of how to get past this limitation. That is their official statement. If you want to capture all packets, use packet mirroring, which I think is a pretty high bar that they're setting on the customers. But
For sure.
I
So we've
think
got
we're
a
about
few.
to, yeah, I think we have to wrap up soon. But yeah, please do
Yeah.
show off the last couple things that you wanted to mention.
Yeah, let's just take a quick look. AWS follows pretty much the same pattern. So there's not a whole lot in here. Again, you can choose so org level management account or single account. Which option, depends on how your AWS org is set up. I tried the management account version first, actually on accident, when I was only trying to do a single account, and I didn't realize it until I downloaded a CloudFormation template. So instead of a bunch of wild GCP commands, AWS gives you a CloudFormation template to upload into your account. So if it's a single account, you have a single template to upload to CloudFormation. That's it. You hit save. If it's a management account, you upload a template and then you create a stack set from that template and you apply the stack set to all of the org accounts to basically get all the resources throughout the whole organization. So I thought that was an interesting difference between the two, is just using the other cloud providers infrastructure as code language now, which is really interesting.
You know what I think about infrastructure as code? I love that.
It's glorious, right?
It's
So
so much better than working in the UI or the CLI.
let me get back to, so this is the console that I launched this into. I will go to IAM and show you at least the same setup as GCP's workload protection. But what you're honestly looking for is in the identity providers. You'll notice I've got that same STS Windows.NET issuer in here. So the provider itself, this is where we're setting up trust, and you can see the same audience, the same thumbprint, from the certificates, and then the provider essentially created inside of here. So now my AWS account trusts Defender's identity provider. The role assumption, which is a little different than how it works in GCP, is managed kind of in the role trust. So if I look for CSPM in here, it created a role called CSPM monitor AWS, and it gives it some permissions, to go read the access, read the resources. We need lots of read-only and security auditor stuff in here. But the trust relationship is where the big piece is. So using that federated identity provider that I just showed you, what we're saying is that incoming JSON request token or web tokens, JWTs, can assume this role if the audience matches an expected value, which that's what Defender's asking for. And it even ties it to a specific role session name, which is going to come over in that request. And if all goes well, it will give Defender temporary access keys to authenticate to all of those AWS resources. So it's kind of neat, again, how they're learning about how the other cloud providers work to set all of this up.
Absolutely. One thing to flag when we go to the permissions tab, we mentioned that it has read-only access, and I just find that really funny because read only sounds pretty innocuous. Oh, it's only readable. Well, what is the scope for this read only access? Your entire account. You could read every resource within your entire account. So don't just look at the words read only and think, okay, we're good. And that's another reason why I hate AWS managed policies. They always grant access to way too many resources. Like,
Yeah,
look at
you
that.
can kind of go through this. I mean, there's a ton in here. I have not read this in quite a while, but what it's supposed to do is give you read-only access to management APIs and not give you access to like data endpoints. So think of like an object in an S3 bucket, something like that. And I think there was a actual bad policy push by AWS at one point where they put like a S3 get objects kind of capability in here that did not go over well with the security community, because now suddenly this policy, or it might have been the support policy, if I'm remembering that right.
Support policy. Yep.
So suddenly their support personnel in theory could have read all of the data from your S3 bucket, which isn't a great feature to have. But you make a good point. Worth reading through this. Make sure Microsoft now is doing the right thing on the policy side for this role.
Yeah, if you keep going down, I think that we'll see some pretty surprising actions. If we go down to the S3 section.
My goodness, there we go.
Yeah, S3. Well, S3 get star. This can get data. This doesn't just get administrative. This gets data.
Valid point. Be aware, now Defender can read all of your bucket data unless you're encrypting them with, a CMK that's not in this policy. That'd be one protection there that would block that.
I have a feeling that it somehow would have the policy to read that key. I mean, maybe you could block it, but probably the scariest thing, if you scroll all the way down to the policy definition, all these actions are scary. That line is what's scariest by far. Yeah. Resource star, ooh. That means everything.
Yeah, I'm actually curious now what's in the custom one, because that is so it looks like, it's a deny policy. That's interesting.
Yeah. It's denying some specific actions. To be continued. We've got about
we'll explore that later. So apparently 2 of those they felt were overly permissive, so they took them out.
Yeah, they probably should just craft their own read-only policy, because this they probably just wanted to leverage what already existed and said, oh, if AWS thinks it's acceptable, we should consider it acceptable. I don't think it's acceptable at all, though. We got one question here. I know traditional AD has an account role for logging only. Do any cloud providers have accounts with permissions to monitor only? Well, I mean, any account that has a permission like security audit would have the ability to only read certain things. And then we just showed the read-only policy that allows you to read everything within the account.
Yeah. Security auditor, I think, is a much better CSPM style policy. I'm curious why Defender needs the full read only, and I'm sure that something broke and they said, well, let's just roll with this for now. But I feel like maybe that should be reported to Microsoft for you that have your account level support there. Maybe ask the question before you turn this on.
Great theory, but they'll say it's by design, so don't expect any bug bounties.
Oh, of course. Yeah. No, not to get rich, but I'm more just curious into the, environment. That's what I'm looking for. So we save all that. Let me uncheck the other stuff. I have no idea how I have an on-prem VM in here, by the way. But if you look at just the AWS ones, I've got, 370 AWS resources are showing up. Here's our RDS database. I'll just pick on that, and we can kind of see what it's complaining about here. So let's see, like database logging's not turned on. We're not using IAM authentication. I believe the configuration on that, it doesn't explicitly prohibit the ability to make things public, even though it doesn't have a public IP. But again, same instructions here, right? Go to the RDS console, hit the modify button, do this, that, and the other. It's pretty impressive how they're pulling all that data in to monitor some of that stuff.
So Stephen has a question here, and then I think we're going to have to wrap up, unfortunately, because as always, we can go on and on and on and on. But Steve says, I wonder what permissions a Playbook in Defender has when run against AWS. I'm going to read that to mean a Azure Logic app or an Azure function, like some kind of thing that responds to an issue. My understanding would be that they don't have any permissions by default, but that you could grant those permissions the same way that you'd grant a regular Azure function permissions.
Yeah, and I don't, maybe workbook, is that what?
I think he's referring to the response capabilities, like an Azure Logic app or an Azure function. But we'll have to leave it there. We can explore the workbooks option the next time. So let's wrap up really quickly to talk about our own personal cloud war story that we've had recently, which was updating our respective courses, Sec 510 Public Cloud Security, AWS, Azure, and GCP, as well as Sec 540 Cloud Security and DevSecOps Automation. We've been working long and hard weekends and nights on updating our lab environment for Sec 510, as well as creating a whole lot of new content. My favorite feature of the new Sec 510 cloud environment is that you are able to choose your own adventure. So if you're really just interested in learning about AWS and GCP, now in this course, we'd recommend that you learn about Azure as well, but you have the choice of determining which clouds you actually care about and which clouds you want to perform the labs for. And then Eric, do you have any quick updates you'd like to give on Sec 540, which you've also created a recent update for?
Yeah, the big one there, we refreshed a lot of the container security content, which was pretty awesome. So we're focusing more on the container lifecycle, getting more into securing Docker files and more image scanning and more, container registry security, as well as kind of runtime protection tooling. And we also added about 16 new labs, which go completely kind of heading down the path you were just mentioning, which is an optional Azure path where you can spend 4 of the days in Azure instead of AWS. So we're trying to let folks use the tool chain that they're familiar with, maybe what you're using at work, or if you're just wanting to explore something and learn a little bit more about some other cloud provider you have not gotten hands-on with. So that's been a lot of work, and I'm excited to see it launch here in a couple of weeks. So it'll be good to get some folks using that stuff on both sides.
And as someone mentioned in the chat, Kat Traxler's new class sounds really cool too on security, cloud security architecture. Can't wait for that to come out. But if you want to learn more about our classes, existing classes, and future classes, make sure to go to sans.org/cloud-security to learn about our courses, as well as get free resources such as posters, cheat sheets, white papers, blog posts, all of that great stuff. And Laura just posted in the LinkedIn chat the links directly to our course details as well. With that, we're going to have to leave it there. But Eric, as always, great talking to you. And thank you all for joining.
Yep, thanks all. Good to see you, Brandon.